All right, so K&R strategist. So I'm going to go ahead and just go over the concept very quickly with you, review it with you, and then I'm just going to go to the one example and quiz you on the one example that most people miss, because a lot of you got this concept very well and got it right first time, so that is awesome. But we talk about K&R strategists. We're basically talking about two different strategies that organisms use to continue on with the population, which of course means reproduction and producing a new population. I think everybody's focus up here, please. Phones need to be put away. I don't want to see them out. Okay? All right, so your case strategists, they typically are your larger organisms. They have a longer lifespan. They tend to have a lower fertility rate. They have less offspring per birthing. But then they also tend to reproduce more times during the lifespan. And they also tend to take care of their young, which means that they have high survivorship early on. They tend to make it, they tend to watch after them until they're ready to get out on their own, more so than our strategists. They tend to be bigger organisms. So your example here would be your polar bears are a typical case strategist. All your mammals, for that matter, are as well. And they will tend to have what we call an S-shaped growth curve. We'll look at the growth curve again in a minute. But it basically means that they start out slow, they go through an exponential growth phase, and then they level out at what we call a carrying capacity. So their populations tend to get to a number that the ecosystem supports, and they tend to stay around that number all the time. Okay? There may be some migration and things like that back and forth, but in general that population in that ecosystem reaches this what we call carrying capacity and stays there for a while. Then you have your R strategists. They're going to be your smaller organisms. I do encourage you to visualize each one of these, and that way you can figure out what kind of properties fit to each one. So visualize an organism in each group, and I like the polar bears and mosquitoes. Mosquitoes in particular because we know here, of course, in Florida, that in the hot summer, after it's been raining, you got a lot of them around. Population numbers are way up. But then when it gets colder, and it mainly gets drier, the population numbers drop down drastically, and then they can be up again. Love bugs would be another example, one that you could show with that. So that's an R strategist type of survival. They basically have short lifespans. So you can put everything into that one reproductive chance oftentimes and have their offspring, and then their offspring can carry on the population after that. And the offspring don't have to compete with the parents for resources like you would in an R strategist or a case strategist kind of population. Now what you see with their numbers, they don't tend to even out and stay the same. They tend to jump up and then jump down, jump up and jump down. Okay, so the characteristic that most people missed on this one was primarily limited by density-independent factors. So primarily limited by density-independent factors. If you think the answer is a case strategist, that they are primarily limited by numbers, put up the letter A. Remember, we put it right here, so we can be discreet so nobody looks at it. And if you think it's an R strategist, put up a B for me, please. Primarily limited by density-independent factors. Answer right here for me, please. Okay. Looks like most of you are getting this correct. Very good. With an R strategist, if you put up B, you got it correct. That is what you would see. What we mean by this is that the things that cause them to die off in great numbers, for example, what causes the mosquitoes numbers population to drop? The what? Anybody? Temperature and water, rainfall, etc. It's a seasonal change, right? Does that have anything to do with how many mosquitoes there are? No. The winter's going to come no matter how many mosquitoes there are. Density, when we talk about density in these two things, there's density independent and density dependent limiting factors. Density means population density. How many of them are packed into a certain area? What we see with the case strategists, like polar bears or people or whatever, is that their numbers climb up in the S-shaped growth curve, and then they hit this level where the population gets dense, and then things start to affect that population. That happens when you've got too many mouths to feed, too many organisms in one space, starvation, disease, overpredation, things like that, running low on oxygen, if it's an aquatic ecosystem, things like that. and that is what we call density-dependent limiting factors. So the test is if the thing that usually kills these things off would happen no matter how many of them there were, that's a density-independent limiting factor. It's independent of what the density is. All right. Questions? Anybody about that? All right. So we got this lovely pair of graphs of population growth. Okay? So you got two of them on here. You have the K-Strategist growth curve, which you can barely see on here, but I'll go ahead and highlight it for you. And that is our S curve. It's a lazy S, granted, but there it is. Okay, that's why they call it an S curve. The J curve is right here. I guess it's in cursive because it's joined together. I don't know, but that's your J curve of your R strategist. Okay, notice how it peaks up and down. We got our exponential growth phase, etc. Which one of these, A, B, C, D, E, or E, is the biotic potential? Biotic potential, that's what most people missed on there. If you think it's E, hold up two cards like that, okay? That's your E. Otherwise, just hold up one card, whatever the letter is for that. So which one of these on this graph is biotic potential? By the way, if you can't see too well, this is A right here. This is a section of the graph. B is this red line across. C is these little green arrows coming down. D is this straight line that's going up like this. And E is this whole blue curve here that I've highlighted part of it. So answers here when you got it. Okay, so we're kind of all over the place with this one. The correct answer, not too many of you got this. The correct answer is D, so you want to study this. Okay, D is the biotic potential, simply because it shows what the K-Strategist, because it's part of the S curve, would do if it had not been limited by the density-dependent limiting factors. That's what your little green arrows are on here. Okay. Now, by the way, you need to know the whole graphs because I might not have the same labels on the test. Okay, so Ms. Riera, heads up, please. Thank you. So anyway, if you didn't have these notice how the curve, the S curve, it's going strong here, and then, like I said, it starts to get hit by amount of starvation, overpredation, disease, all these density-dependent limiting factors, things that happen to it because it's getting too crowded. And levels off here what we call the carrying capacity, that's B right there. But if it didn't have those factors, it would continue on this line here, which technically should be curved because it's exponential, but nevertheless it goes on past there. And it's just representing what would happen if you didn't have the limiting factors in place. This is your J curve for your R strategist. It goes up, and then you can't really see that these are arrows here too well, but these long black lines are coming down here. If that was labeled, that would be your density independent limiting factors, because you notice they're the ones that are affecting the R strategist, like we said in the previous question. Okay. Questions? Anybody about the graphs? What they mean? Know what the different parts are on the curves? That kind of thing. All right. Moving along. Yeah, this is a good question. A lot of people miss. So let's do this one. So which of the following is true about replacement left? Can't do my ABCs. Replacement level fertility. Can you guys go back and read this? Can you read all these all the way down here? Okay, so I'll let you go ahead and read through that and put your answers here when you got it. me what you got for answers, please. Looking really good. Looks like most of you got this right. E is your correct answer there. The replacement level fertility is simply how many children a couple needs to have to replace themselves. So obviously a couple is 2. It takes 2 to make a baby. You guys are clear on that concept, right? And so if you have 2 children, and of course if it distributes out, one boy or one girl, that population number will stay the same if those children grow up and have 2 children and so on, right? However, that would be ideal scenario. That's not how they do replacement fertility in real life situations. They have to account for the fact that not all the children are going to grow up and have children. That they'll die before their fertility rates. They don't look into whether or not they decide to have children or not. They just look at it as to whether or not they reach reproductive age. So of course that means that if they don't, then you need to have more children. And therefore your society, if it has a high infant mortality rate, if it has a lot of children that are dying off before they reach reproductive age, or more so than others, then it means that you have to have a higher replacement fertility level. So what we see is that in pre-industrial and transitional societies, you have, pre-industrial, remember, is before they get any kind of access, healthcare, stuff like that. You're looking at replacement level fertility that runs around 2.8 or so. So that would be how many they would have to account for those that are lost through infant mortality rates. Transitional usually drops down to about 2.4. And then after that, in an industrial society or post-industrial, it's 2.1. Okay, so that's the extra amount that's on there is to account for those that die before they reach reproductive age, and therefore it needs to be higher if they have a higher infant mortality rate, because of course that's what it means. It means that children are dying before they reach that age. Alright, so let's go through this real quick. These are our graphs of the demographic transition and the phases that societies have been observed to go through, typically. A lot of it's economic, and there's also cultural parts to it as well, particularly when we look at male and female roles in these societies. With a pre-industrial society, you have your high birth and death rates. Death rates are high, lack of medicine, malnutrition, sanitation, those kind of things like that, death and childbirth, both the mother and the child. And so they have high birth rates. To compensate for that is one thing. So, if you have 6 children and 3 of them die, you might be tended to have more children, or 4 of them, or whatever. And also it represents a source of wealth, because it's a primarily agricultural society, so the more of your family that you have working on the farm, the more you can produce, and therefore the more profitable and everything your farm can be. So it's an economic advantage as well. Because of that, it tends to be a cultural thing. It's actually a status symbol to have a big family. This is still true in many countries, by the way. India, for example, in many of your developing countries, it shows that you're wealthy in a sense, assuming they're not all starving to death. And so what happens then in your transitional type society, this is where most of the world is right now, is that modern agriculture and medicine come in and drop the death rate very quickly. But the birth rate, because it is a cultural thing, tends to stay up there for a while. And it also is still somewhat profitable to have more children, because you still have a lot of your population is on the farm, but a lot of them are going into factories. A lot of times in these countries they don't have child labor laws. And so you can send your kids off to work and bring in a paycheck as well, and therefore more kids you have, the more money you have in the household. When we get to so by the way, consequently, obviously you can see from the graphs here, your birth rate, death rate, your population growth is going to be birth rate minus death rate, and therefore in this time period you get very rapid population growth, okay, because the birth rate stays up there but the death rate drops off. Then when you get into the industrial phase of it, this is a major shift in what most people do for a living, from the farm into city and industrial and things like that. And it becomes economically better to have both spouses work, to have both spouses be as educated as possible. There's opportunities within the workforce, and there are changing attitudes towards the roles of women. One of the reasons why, because they see that, hey, my wife works, I've got double the income coming in, and therefore birth rates tend to drop because women, when they go to school and pursue a career, they start having children later if they do it all, and therefore they tend to have less. Okay, and so that will progress along, and many, the United States and many other countries around the world are in this particular phase. But eventually, if that fertility rate continues to drop, and women have less and less children to the point where they're having less than replacement fertility, eventually the birth rate is going to drop down below the death rate. You can see the death rate kind of goes up here a little bit and bumps around. That's simply because you're going to have, from back here when you had rapid growth, you're going to start to have people in an older population dying off and things. So that's what it takes to get to the point where your population will stabilize out, and then eventually it will start to decrease. Now I say eventually because we still have to, when you have this kind of transition, you still have to wait for those populations to basically die off. You have to go through their whole lifespan for the population actually to start to decrease. That concept, by the way, which shows that even though your fertility rate drops and everything, but the population stays high for a while, what was that called? That was another. Population momentum, very good. So I didn't cover that question that's on there, so make sure you understand that that's why you basically are waiting for that big population bulge to go through the population and to die off, and of course the deaths are what's going to take the the numbers of the population down. So any questions about those sections on there and everything? So let's just go through. I'm not going to have you do the cards, but let's say 1, 2, 3, or 4 for all of these. High birth and death rates. Say it out for me, please.
1.
Stage 1, good. Fertility rate drops to low replacement fertility.
16.
4. 16 is not an option. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Very good. 4. So that's when you're post-industrial. Transitional phase. 2. Nutrition and medicine are introduced. 2 as well. So that's why the death rate drops off. Industrial phase. 3. Very good. All right. So then we have these guys here. Histograms. Population distribution shows you what age group most of the people in that population are in. Each one of these is 5 years, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and so on, 6 to 10. And the blue, what's the blue represent? What are these people in this population? They're what? Pre-reproductive, yeah. So they're before their reproductive years. They didn't. This particular ones didn't highlight the end of that time period, but usually about up to here, what, 15, 30. Well, anyway, 45 or so. They tend to be where the post-reproductive is. So with this one, which one of these would grow the fastest? A, B, or C? Just say it out. A, okay. Slowest or even negative? B, you got your aging population. Think of a coffin here, dying off, that kind of thing. And then your C, that wasn't one of the choices in this one, but C is in industrial. Typically, you got a more or less even distribution. It's starting to move towards this. It's basically between these two right here. You have, in this case, you will have 0 to, or slow to 0 growth. So fast population growth, 0 to negative, typically negative for this one, for B, and then 0 to slow. And so this is transitional, industrial, post-industrial. You'll notice the pre-industrial is not on there. Pre-industrial we don't usually use histograms for. Okay. So we good on that, identifying which one of those is which and what they represent, what kind of societies they're associated with? Questions on that? No? All right. So that is it for populations. Now we're going to go on to water and soil resources. Now, notice the Unit 3 vocab and things like that. I'm not going to do a separate matching question for vocab. Okay, like I have been doing. So you don't have to worry about restudying all that vocab and things like that. Just not going to do it. So it'll all be multiple choice, and any calculation questions, you're still responsible for that for half-lives and the 2 types of population calculations I had on here. Rule of 70 and what was one of them, and the other one was just simply percentage growth given births and deaths, etc. So you'll still have those on there. They'll be in a multiple choice form though. So I'm not going to have one of the box types on there to answer, but go ahead and do those on your Unit 3 vocab. Make sure you know how to do those, and also your half-life problems that review those. So you get a few of those on there, not many. But the unit as a separate thing, a separate matching question, I'm not going to do the 3, 4, or 5 vocab on there. Okay, they'll just be incorporated in the multiple choice question. Questions about that? Everybody good? Understand? All right, so now we can go on to what? Water and soil resources. Turn your phone off, please. Silence it. All right. This is one that many people missed. Not sure why. Pretty sure it's directly in the notes, but here you go. Heads up. It's not. Acid deposition can be controlled by limiting burning of fuels containing what? A, sulfur, B, carbon, C, sodium, D, phosphorus. Is the element. Mr. Vieira, what do you think? See an answer, please. Say it out there. Okay. All right. Yeah, you're supposed to be using our cards here. That's all right. All right. So anyway, most of you got this right. Very good, I think, except for at least one of you. Sulfur is the correct answer there. Yeah. A. Yeah. So just something to remember. Sulfur equals acid. One way might be to memorize it. Think of the acid sulfuric acid. You ever heard of sulfuric acid? Maybe associate that in your mind. Sulfur, sulfuric acid. That's actually the acid that's typically produced when you burn fuels that contain sulfur in them. You also may remember that we talked about acid mine drainage. We talked about that was a problem because when you dig up stuff, a lot of it has sulfur in it. The bacteria eat the sulfur, and so consequently, this is the main ingredient in acid production in the environment. So that's what you need to remember. Sulfur for that one. And then if you do have acid deposition, what can you do about it? Effects of acid deposition can be limited by the addition of blank to the soil. A, worms, B, sulfur, C, calcium oxide, or D, fertilizer. You don't need me to write the letters back up there, right? Yeah. So. So pretty good, and I'm seeing some consistency in wrong answers in that a number of you are putting fertilizer, okay? Fertilizer is not very specific as far as what kind of chemical it is. Some of them are a little acidic, some of them are more basic. So that's not what we would look for specifically if we wanted to neutralize the soil. The one up here that is actually is a basic compound is calcium oxide, C. So most of you got that, that's good. All of your metal oxides, calcium oxide, iron oxide, magnesium oxide, sodium oxide, all of those are basic compounds. So they will interact with an acid to neutralize it. Or another term for basic is alkali. CaO is actually also called lime, not the fruit, but the chemical lime. You can buy this in garden centers and Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever. Commonly used, it's commonly your soil problem that needs to be adjusted is acidity. Most plants are better adapted to a more basic or alkali soil, but sometimes your soil is too alkali. Any guesses as to what you might add if that were the case? I'll give you a hint. We just talked about it. Sulfur. Yeah, sulfur. So you can put sulfur. Sulfur itself as an element is neutral. Your elements are all neutral, but sulfur, if you put it in your soil, the bacteria will then eat the sulfur and they produce an acidic byproduct, which was what happened when we talked about acid mine drainage. So once again, sulfur equals acid. So that would then take the pH back down. It would neutralize out the alkali component. But the answer for this one is your calcium oxide, also known as lime, L-I-M-E. Like limestone. Alrighty, got that, got that, got that, got that, got that, got that, got that. There we go. This is one that gave people some trouble. The tragedy of the comments. You didn't see it? Did you see it? It was tragic out here in the comments. Anyway, so which volume best illustrates the concept of tragedy of the commons? Frankly, it's tragic if you're a commoner, I believe. Disgust me. Whitney's already ready. She must be a fast reader, or she liked the first answer very well. Nice, okay, all right, let's see something a little bit better. Alrighty, okay. So, yeah, not doing too bad there. What you get, Mr. Reggie? What you going with it? You can go with that one? Okay. Before I tell you which one is the right answer, I will tell you which one is the wrong answer, but most of the ones that were getting it wrong put this one. They put B, which is not correct. And I will point out that you need to have, if to be an example of tragedy of the commons, you got to have a tragedy and you got to have the commons. Okay. So if we look at B, we see a tragedy here in the inadvertent destruction of beneficial species. And so we killed stuff that we didn't want to kill that were good for the area, while attempting to control pests. So it doesn't say specifically where this is happening. Okay. But where do you think you usually try to control pests? Where does that usually happen?
In agriculture.
In agriculture, most agriculture is private, okay? And therefore, if it's on private land, that's not common land, that's not shared land, okay? So B is missing the commons component, all right? So let me go through the rest of them anyway, just to show you. It's an important concept to understand. Next one, shared lake. Okay, so this one does have a common area, the shared lake, so it meets that criteria. Legislation of catch limits to avoid depletion of fish stocks. Do you think that is a tragic thing or a bad thing? No, that's actually trying to avoid a tragedy. So it doesn't fit the tragedy part of it. So it's got the common but not the tragedy. This one here, right there, private land, cross that one off. You know that's not going to be a tragedy of the commons. Private lands are not common areas that people share. And then this one we've got a national forest, so we got the commons area, but we have selective harvesting of trees. Selective harvesting of trees, comparatively speaking, that's okay, right? That's not a tragedy per se if it's done correctly, right? We've learned that. So if it said clear cutting, then yeah, that would be a tragedy of the commons, because clear cutting's bad. Selective harvesting, if you're going to harvest trees, this is the way to do it. It can be done sustainably. So no tragedy there. That leaves us with decline in fish population. So there's your tragedy. But it doesn't specify where, okay? So this is where we had to have a little bit of knowledge of where most commercial fishing takes place. And where does most of it take place? Okay. Out in the open ocean, which is a common area. And even if it's not the ocean itself, the fish themselves are a common resource because they go in and out of those areas, obviously. They don't stay in one particular area. So it's a common resource, and therefore it can be depleted if it's not managed well. All right. Questions? Anybody? Tragedy of the commons? Alright. Soil salinization. Let's look at this one. What is best of remediating the effects of soil salinization? Soil salinization. Alrighty, then. Looking kind of all over the place with the wrong answers. Only a few of you are getting this right, so everybody needs to pay close attention, particularly if you did not answer D for your answer. D is the correct answer, by the way. Okay. So soil salinization is, as the name implies, it means the soil is too salty. Not salt like table salt per se, but minerals that have built up from using a lot of groundwater and surface water. Okay. But if salt helps you to memorize it, then that's good as well, because it could be regular salt. And I'll use that as an example as well, because let me give you maybe a scenario that you can figure it out. Let's say you had one bowl of rice to eat, and that was all you had to eat. And then your little brother came up and grabbed a big thing of salt and just poured it all in there. So it would basically be inedible, which, by the way, you can poison yourself to death with eating really concentrated salt. So this is all you had to eat. What would you do? Add some water, maybe just kind of like rinse it out, right? Maybe hold it back and rinse the water through it, keep rinsing and rinsing and rinsing it. So you got rid of that extra salt, right? Which one of those does that look the most like? Dish in large amounts of water, leach out salts. So that's what they do. So what happens is that in these fields, this happens in areas where they don't have a lot of natural rainfall. It's a big problem in the Middle East. It's actually a problem in California as well, because the areas of California where they grow stuff actually don't get that much rainfall. But so in order to grow crops and things, they use a lot of well water, or they use a lot of surface water, water from lakes and stuff. Both well and surface water have minerals in them. Okay, rainwater does not. And so if you keep watering with them over and over again, those minerals build up in the soil, and it gets to the point where they're so built up that the plants won't grow. Just like if you poured salt on the ground, or if you put too much fertilizer on your yard, I guarantee it'll kill it. So when that becomes a problem, though, about the only thing they can do besides just completely replace the soil is to rinse the soil out. So they'll typically put a barrier, not big, but they put what they call a silt barrier around. It's a permeable cloth, or sometimes they use hay bales to do that. They put it all the way around the field, and they just keep pumping as fresh of water as possible. Granted, they're probably using the same stuff they used before, but since they're using huge quantities of it, they keep flooding it, let the water run out and everything, and they can test the salinity of it with a little, very simple meter, and they keep doing that until it gets back to normal salinity. And that's how you fix that. Now, if you put addition of lime to raise soil pH, this was what we just talked about, so just to show you, that's your calcium oxide. That's if you see that lime there, once again, not the fruit, but the chemical. So that goes back to the question we just did a minute ago, but that would be for remediating this acid precipitation. So this is what you do if you have to have soil salinization. All right. We'll come back to that triangle in a minute. We'll do one of those, but let's go ahead and take a look at this one. I'll miss this one. Short and sweet, but not too sweet apparently for some people. Okay, there. On this one. Alrighty. You guys answers up here, please? Let's see what you got. Okay. All right. So the correct answer is sand. Okay. So you guys, maybe a little less than half of you got that. Let me show you why. An important concept about the physical properties of soil. And soil is made up of two main things: organic and inorganic content. The organic content, that's your humus. Okay, that's dead, decaying material. It does have an effect on water retention, which I'll talk about in a second, but not really so much with aeration. You can't really nail down how it affects aeration. Not a bad answer, but not the best answer, because we talked specifically about the other part, which is the inorganic. Most of your soil is inorganic, bits of sediment and rock that have eroded away and washed down and filled in. That's your sand, silt, or clay, and it is classified as that by the size of the particles. So sand particles are the biggest ones, and then silt ones are smaller than that, and then clay particles are actually microscopic. The individual particles of clay are microscopic, so they're tiny little particles. Okay, so the size of these particles has a big impact on two properties of the sand, of the soil, that are very important for plants. serve a function for plants that are planted in them. One of them is aeration, because plants need air too. They need oxygen. Most plants get it from their roots. Okay? Most terrestrial plants. And then the other one is kind of the opposite, and that is water retention. Oh, I just hate that load feeling. And so they basically are opposite of each other based upon this. Okay, so picture it this way: if you've got 3 buckets, each one filled with sand, silt, and clay, respectively, and you've got holes in the buckets, and you poured water into each one of the buckets. Think about what would happen with each. We'll go from the water retention perspective because that actually is related to the aeration. So what about the sand? Would it hold back the water very well, or would it let it go through? Would it pour through quickest in the sand, silt, or the clay? It would go through the sand pretty easily. Okay, so sandy soil does not retain water very well. And then what about clay? If you had a big bucket of the clay powder, pour water into it, what do you think would happen? Hardly any of it would come out. It actually probably would solidify or would gel up enough. And as a matter of fact, clay, when you have it underground, it oftentimes forms that barrier we talked about. When we talked about aquifers, shallow, deep aquifers. Remember that? In Florida, that's where the water will not go through because the clay, so the particles just so small it binds up. So this has a high level of water retention. So if you needed your soil to retain more water, you would want to add clay to it. Less if you would add sand to it. Silt's in the middle for both of those. Okay, and the reason for the water tension is also the opposite reason for the aeration. Sand does not retain water very well because it has big air spaces in between it because it's made out of bigger particles. So aeration in sand is high, and in clay it's low. So they're opposites of each other there. And therefore, if you needed your soil to be more aerated, let's say you were growing a plant that was adapted to maybe a desert or a beach kind of soil, it would need that. It's adapted to have that kind of sandy soil, and Florida plants are like that as well. Florida has sandy soil, so it needs more aeration. Some plants that live in the clay or they live in wetland environments and things like that, they need more water retention. They don't need as much air. So you'd want their soils to retain more water, therefore you'd add clay to it. Okay. So that is why sand would be added to your water, or to your soil if you wanted it to have more aeration. Does that make sense? Do you have a question?
If water can pass through sand so easily, then why do people use sandbags for flooding?
Sand is easier, cheaper to move around and stuff, more readily available. Clay is not so much. It may be that they want the sand to remain flexible with the clay bags, that they would solidify and harden up and things. But I think it's generally just kind of an expense thing. It's easier to handle because this clay, it gets all over the place. It's all the dust and stuff. I think sand, it's enough to hold it back. That would be my answer. I'm not an expert on sandbagging and stuff like that, but good question. But comparatively speaking, is there? And we don't even really, silt. Silt's kind of an in-between kind of thing that you don't really think about. You can buy sand, or you can buy clay. You don't really buy silt, but it just happens to be the in-between kind of thing there. So there's your relationships between water retention and aeration and particle size. And we're going to go back up and do a soil triangle real quick because I know you love them. And just make sure you know how to do this. The test I gave the example 40, 40, 20. Well, let's do another one. Let's say we've got 10% clay and I don't know, 40% silt. Is that like I gave you before? No, 20%. And then 50% sand. So if you were given that, you would figure out which particular soil type it would be. Like I said, different plants need different types of soil. That's why you do something like this to determine if you need to add something to it or something like that. So we start out on the clay side, and we go to the number, the percent for the clay. And then this one is, just remember, you start on the clay side, you're going to make a horizontal line. So you can go across here at the 10% mark, right there. Okay. Then we can go to the silt side, 40% silt. And just the thing you have to remember, once you've done the first one there, the horizontal one, that your next lines all need to cross it. So that's how you know where to go from there. So we're going to draw this line down here. Boom, right there. And then we can go to 50% sand and go up like that. And that gives us, it's still a loam, loamy type of soil. It's getting close to being a sandy loam, as you can see there. But that's your ideal, that's the type of soil mixture that you need for that. Or that's, if you needed a loam soil, you could make it from this particular mixture. So, questions about how to do the triangle? You guys good over here? Heads up, paying attention? All right. Yeah.
If we have like one of those on the test, would you be able to give us like a paper one so we can actually draw on it?
Yeah.
It's hard to do it on the computer.
I know. I'll think about it. Yeah. All right, that's it for that one. So that leaves us with agriculture, forest, fish, mining, etc. We'll go to that, and I'll probably tomorrow. We don't have much time, but I think I'll go through some of the most frequent missed ones on the one we just took. I can't do them right now because I still have some people in other classes that haven't taken it yet, the Unit 5 test. But it will, of course, be on there. I will say this, that I'm not going to include it with this. Everybody's clear on this assignment, right? It's going to be due midnight Sunday, by the way. Okay. I'll get that posted on eCampus. But you know what to do here. Retake highest score. I put all the scores together. That makes a test score. Very important, very high value assignment here. The one we just took, Unit 5, I'm not going to include in this for the grade. But by end of day tomorrow, by 3 p.m. tomorrow, I should be able to open it up so you can at least look at it. I'll tell you which ones you got wrong, that kind of thing. But I'm not going to make an assignment. I'm also not going to open it up for, well, I guess I can open it up for retake. But that'll just be so you can check yourself rather than actually getting a grade for it. Okay? All right. So, agriculture. Alright, approximately how many calories of feed would be needed to produce 100 calories of beef? The feed for the cattle, of course. Supposed to be the way. No, you don't need to be on there now. Let you focus on this so you can answer your questions later. And see what you guys are coming up with for answers as well. So, all right, looking pretty. Good. Looking pretty good. Okay, so. This has to do with the environmental impact of eating meat being greater than eating produce, vegetables, grains, etc. And the big part of that is because if you're going to eat an animal, a consumer, you've got to also raise the food for that consumer. Okay, and it means that if you eat higher on the food chain, then that takes more resources. Both environmentally speaking, economically speaking. That's why we see it in developing nations. They don't eat as much meat as we do. It's just simple economics of it. And so consequently, this follows also the ecological pyramid. So you got to reach back in your mind there to when we did that. And with that ecological pyramid, what percentage is passed from one level to the next? Mr. Vieira? How much is passed from producers to consumers in our ecological pyramid, percentage-wise? Any guesses? No guess?
Well, last time you told me not to say it.
Huh? No, I'm doing a discussion now. We're not doing the cards. I already did the cards. Yeah. You give me a guess. Well, actually, no. You just have to answer. If you're just going to guess, then we'll...
Oh, 1,000.
You remember what percentage is passed? Ms. Murphy? I'm going to move on. Ms. Murphy?
10%.
10%. Okay, so ecological pyramid, everything relates together. That's what has to do with this. So when you have producers absorbing energy, absorbing nutrients, building biomass and tissue and storing energy there, whatever eats that producer only gets about 10% of what they absorb. And therefore, if you want to produce 100 calories of a producer, i.e. cow or beef, you would have to raise 10 times as much of that. So that means the correct answer is 1,000. Okay?
Okay.
All right. All right, we're done. Well, this is the last test, you guys, so bear with me, focus, stay awake, keep your heads up, pay attention. You may be thankful when we take the actual exam. All right, next question. Crop rotation reduces blank for pests. Good, pretty good. And I will say the one that most of you that are getting wrong are answering is a good answer as well, simply because it's a possible answer. In your notes, it's stated directly as this particular reason. Let's look at this way. What's the first priority for organisms after water? Food. Then shelter. And then they get down to the business of reproducing. That's basically the order in which the things adapt and find their way, etc. So if you've got a problem with potato beetles, what do potato beetles eat?
Potatoes.
Really? No, they eat potato plants. But that's potatoes are part of that plant. So if you then plant tomatoes the next year, what do you think those potato beetles are going to do?
Go away.
They're going to move or die or whatever else, and they're not going to have their food supply anymore. Most pests are pretty crop specific. That's why for almost every crop you have a particular insect that's named after it because it eats it a lot, like your potato beetles. And therefore, if you rotate your crops, if you use a different crop the next year, not only is that good for the soil, but also can reduce pests by reducing their food supply. One of the things you got to be careful of is not reading it out too far and saying, all right, well, maybe they don't have enough food now, maybe then they won't have shelter, or maybe they won't be as fertile because of that. If you start to go into the maybes or making multiple connections, you're missing the best answer. Is it a possible answer that crop rotation will reduce fertility for pests? Yes. Is it the best, most definitive answer? No, the best one that for sure is the food supply for them. And I don't know if they live on the plants or not. I got it. Shelter is important, no doubt, but it's not first priority. Or second priority, it's third. All right. This one a lot of people missed, but possibly because the wording was a little difficult, but let's go ahead and take a look at it. See what we think. Aquaculture. Get your answers up, please. Mr. Zenke, got an answer for me? What do you think, Miss Cullen? You have cards. Really? You've been back there the whole time without cards? That's not good. Go get it. actually looking pretty good here. Did you have something, Ms. Bone? I want to see what you got. What's your answer? Let's see. Read through it. Okay. So, problem with this question is that you may be tempted to switch it around and say not a disadvantage, double negative. So we're going to look for one that's an advantage. That doesn't always work. It doesn't actually work with this particular one either. Because the correct answer is not an advantage of aquaculture. It's just not a disadvantage of it. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and look at this from the perspective of one of the things that we know are disadvantages of aquaculture. So that will give us a little review of that particular issue. Probably number one with aquaculture, biggest disadvantage to it is the fact that typically these fish cages and stuff like that are put into wetland areas. They clear out wetland areas to do it. Most aquaculture operations are not on land. They're actually out in the water. They just cordon off an area and put their fish or their shrimp or whatever in there and raise them like that. That also tends to make a lot of the problems that are associated with aquaculture. So a lot of wetland destruction. We saw the video about how particularly mangrove forests in Southeast Asia and stuff, or mangrove swamps, have been cleared for shrimp aquaculture. Increased pollution is a problem with aquaculture. You've got them in these pens and stuff. They're in the water. You're putting feed in there. They're high density. Fish are pooping, etc. Therefore, that's a problem as well from that. Weakening of the natural gene pool. This means the fact that some of the fish may get out and reproduce with the wild populations. This is always an issue in agriculture that can cause problems. They don't even have to get out, actually. They typically are in cages, and they're external spawners, so you could theoretically have some reproduction going on while still in the cage. I know of a dog. We had a puppy that was born that way through that, so a dog could do it. I imagine fish can do it as well. So that leaves us with increased bycatch. Okay, and actually one of the advantages of aquaculture is that you don't have bycatch. Bycatch is where you go out and throw a big net out and you pull in a bunch of fish, and you've got a lot of fish that you don't want. And a lot of those fish, what we call bycatch, is a fish that you're not trying to catch. A lot of times they'll die from it, the fish will, but in particular bycatch is a bad thing when we talk about dolphins and turtles because of course they need to breathe, and so they're more likely to drown in these nets, and they also tend to be more endangered than your fish populations and stuff, particularly with the turtles. So the correct answer is increased bycatch is not a disadvantage of aquaculture. It's an advantage of it if you switch this around and put decreased bycatch, so you could say that, but increased bycatch is your correct answer there. Questions about that? Or aquaculture in general? Mamma mia. I think that might be it as far as the things that a lot of people, more than 80% of people missed. So I'm going to stop it there and let you guys study on your own. And work on retakes of these. So that'll be what you need to do for the rest of the period, quietly. And if you're on your phones, you will be on your phones to do your